The moment I realized my daughter had invited me to her wedding out of duty rather than love was the moment I heard laughter drift through the half-closed door of the bridal suite, followed by her voice, soft, careful, and edged with a kind of embarrassment I had never heard directed at me before. It's a strange thing, the way sound carries in those fancy hotels. The walls look thick, all marble and polished wood, but laughter slips right through them like smoke under a door. I wasn't eavesdropping. At least, not at first. I'd only stepped out of the ballroom to give my collar a little air. My tie felt tighter than it ought to, and that old navy suit, God help me, hadn't been new since the early '80s. I'd pressed it myself the night before in my little apartment, careful around the elbows where the fabric had gone thin. It still smelled faintly of starch and the cedar blocks I kept in the closet. Inside the ballroom, everything glittered like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. Waiters in black vests floated between tables carrying trays of champagne that sparkled under the lights. Every table had flowers piled so high they looked like small gardens, white roses and lilies, heavy with perfume. Linen cloths draped down to the floor, and the chairs had satin bows tied around them. You could hear the soft clink of glassware, the low hum of polite conversation, the occasional laugh that sounded practiced rather than joyful. The kind of wedding where people say, darling, and lovely, a lot. My daughter belonged there. Or at least she had grown into someone who did. Emily always had a way of doing that, growing past the places she started. When she was little, she used to run barefoot through the yard behind our old farmhouse in Iowa, her hair tangled from the wind, holding mason jars full of lightning bugs. She'd sit on the porch steps with me while I drank iced tea and told her stories about the tractors I used to fix. Back then she thought I knew everything. Funny how time rearranges those beliefs. I stood outside that bridal suite door adjusting my cuffs when I heard one of the bridesmaids say something about the father. There was a pause. Then my daughter laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. Not exactly. But it had that nervous edge people get when they're trying to smooth over something awkward. Oh God, she said softly. Just ignore the suit. He refuses to buy a new one. More laughter. He's from a different world, she added. Different world. The words sat in the hallway like dust floating in sunlight. I didn't move. Someone else said something I couldn't quite hear, and Emily answered quickly. No, he's sweet. Really. Just a little country. Country. She said it the way people say, old furniture. Useful once. Embarrassing now. I stood there staring down at the toes of my shoes, polished that morning until they shined like black mirrors. The leather had cracked along one seam years ago, but if you buffed them right you could hide it. You'd be surprised what careful polishing can hide. The hallway smelled faintly of perfume and fresh flowers. For a moment I thought about knocking anyway. Pretending I hadn't heard anything. But I found my hand drifting back to my pocket instead, where I kept the folded speech card I'd written the night before. My fingers pressed against it through the fabric. Thin cardstock. 4 short paragraphs. I'd rewritten those lines 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table under a single lamp while the rest of the building slept. I wanted to say the right thing. That's all a father really wants at a moment like that, to say something that belongs to the day without making it about himself. After a minute, the door opened. One of the bridesmaids stepped out, nearly bumping into me. Oh. Sorry, she said, then gave me a polite smile that flickered for half a second when she noticed my suit. The smile came back quickly though. Well trained. Mr. Carter, right? Emily's dad? That's me, I said. She nodded and slipped past me down the hall in a cloud of floral perfume. I didn't step inside the room. Instead I turned back toward the ballroom. The doors stood open now, and the music had started. Soft piano, something classical I couldn't name. People were finding their seats. The groom's family had arrived. You could tell them immediately. They carried themselves like they belonged under chandeliers. Tailored suits that fit like second skin. Shoes that gleamed without a single crease. Women in dresses that moved like silk water when they walked. Money has a posture to it. Confidence in the shoulders. Ease in the hands. I took a seat at the table marked family. Across from me sat Harold Whitmore, the groom's father. Tall man. Silver hair combed straight back. Cufflinks that probably cost more than my pickup truck used to. He gave me a cordial nod. Mr. Carter. Harold. His wife sat beside him, delicate as porcelain in a pale blue gown. She glanced once at my sleeves where the fabric had thinned, then returned to her champagne. Not unkind. Just observant. The ceremony itself passed like a dream you remember only in pieces. Emily walking down the aisle in a white dress that shimmered like snowfall. The quiet intake of breath from the guests. The groom, Daniel, standing tall and polished in his tuxedo. He seemed like a good man. I'd only met him a handful of times, but he shook hands firmly and spoke respectfully. Sometimes that's enough. When Emily reached the altar, she glanced toward me for just a second. A quick look. Hard to read. Maybe nerves. Maybe something else. The vows were beautiful. Simple. They promised patience, partnership, the usual things young people believe they'll never struggle with. People dabbed their eyes with folded napkins. Even Harold cleared his throat once. Afterward came the reception. And that's where the evening began to stretch long. The ballroom had transformed while we were in the chapel. Lights dimmed to a golden glow. The chandeliers cast soft halos over the tables. A jazz trio played quietly near the dance floor. Crystal glasses chimed as people lifted them in little celebratory clinks. Waiters moved gracefully between tables pouring wine. The scent of roasted chicken and garlic drifted through the room. Everywhere you looked there were polished shoes gliding over marble floors. Everything gleamed. Everything felt smooth and expensive. I sat quietly through most of it. Watched my daughter move from table to table greeting guests. She looked happy. Radiant even. That counts for something. At one point Harold leaned toward me and said, in a tone meant to be friendly, "You must be proud." "I am," I told him. And I meant it. But pride can sit beside a lot of other feelings without saying a word. Later, when dessert plates had been cleared and the band paused for speeches, the room shifted slightly. You can feel it when people expect something. Chairs angled toward the front. Voices quieted. The best man spoke first. A few jokes. Some stories about college days. Laughter rippled across the room like wind through tall grass. Then the maid of honor. More laughter. A few tears. Soft applause. Finally the DJ tapped the microphone. "Now," he said, smiling broadly, "we'd like to invite the bride's father to say a few words." For a moment the room blurred a little around the edges. Not from anger. Just from the weight of the moment settling in my chest. I reached into my pocket. Pulled out that small folded card. My fingers trembled just slightly as I stood. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But enough that I felt it. As I walked toward the microphone, the polished floor reflected the chandeliers above me like scattered stars. Rows of faces turned in my direction. Daniel's family. Emily's friends. Business partners. People who lived in a world of boardrooms and charity galas. And somewhere in the back of that crowd stood my daughter. Watching. Waiting. I reached the microphone. It squealed briefly with a sharp burst of feedback before settling into a low hum. I unfolded the card slowly. Then I looked out across that bright, expensive room. And before I said a single word, I noticed Emily watching me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a little girl, standing at the edge of a diving board, half hopeful, half afraid of what might happen next. I stood there with that little speech card in my hands, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded so many times the night before, and the room waited the way big rooms do, quiet but full of tiny sounds. A glass set gently onto a table. The rustle of a napkin. Someone shifting in their chair. The microphone hummed softly in front of me. For a second I could see my reflection in the polished metal stand, warped and thin like an old photograph left in the rain. I cleared my throat. "Evening, folks." My voice came out steady enough. A few polite smiles appeared around the room. Harold Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his vest. The band members stood quietly off to the side of the dance floor, instruments resting in their laps. And Emily, my little girl in that white dress that probably cost more than my first truck, watched me with her hands folded together at her waist. I looked down at the card. Then back up. "You know," I said, "I spent most of last night trying to write something impressive." A ripple of light laughter moved through the room. I figured weddings like this probably call for impressive words. A few people nodded. "But the truth is," I continued, tapping the card gently against the microphone stand, "I've never been much for speeches." Another small chuckle. I paused long enough to look across the room again. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light and scattered it everywhere. The flowers on each table gave off that sweet, heavy perfume that reminds you of spring even when you're indoors. Everything about the place looked polished. Perfect. "I've known Emily for 30 years, I said. "Which means I've had about 30 years to learn something important." I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the podium. "She's always been heading somewhere bigger than where she started." That line landed softly. People leaned forward just a little. "When she was 6, I went on, she told her first-grade teacher she was going to live in a city with buildings so tall you couldn't see the tops." A few guests smiled. I remember asking her why. I glanced toward Emily. She looked surprised now, maybe wondering where the story was going. She said, "Because tall things mean something exciting is happening." Gentle laughter drifted across the tables. And I suppose she was right. I paused. The room stayed quiet. Now, Emily grew up in a house where the most exciting building in town was the grain elevator. More laughter. But even back then I could tell she wasn't going to stay there. I lifted the speech card slightly. "I used to sit on the porch with her at night catching lightning bugs in mason jars. She'd hold them up and say they looked like tiny cities." I took a slow breath. And I guess tonight she finally made it to one. The chandeliers glowed warmly above us. For a moment nobody spoke. Then I continued. "You all see the woman she is now. Confident. Successful. Beautiful." A few heads turned toward Emily. "And I'm proud of her for every step she took to get here." I let that line sit for a moment. Pride has a weight to it when it's spoken out loud. Then I unfolded the card the rest of the way. There was a small crease across the center where my thumb had pressed into it the night before. "But there's something I realized a long time ago about raising kids," I said. "They don't grow by staying close to the place they started." A few older guests nodded slowly. "You help them climb. You give them whatever ladder you can build." My fingers tightened slightly around the card. Sometimes that ladder is time. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's things you give up so they don't have to. The room had gone completely still now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. I looked down at the card again, but I already knew the words. "About 12 years ago," I said quietly, "Emily got accepted to Columbia." That name moved through the room like a breeze. People recognized it. Respected it. She called me late one night to tell me. I smiled a little at the memory. She sounded scared. A soft murmur of understanding passed across a few tables. Not because she didn't want to go, I said. She was scared because she knew we couldn't afford it. I could hear someone shift their chair near the back of the room. I kept my voice even. Now, Emily didn't know this at the time, but that same week I had a meeting with a bank in Des Moines. I ran my thumb along the edge of the card. I owned about 40 acres back then. Land my father left me. The room had grown very quiet. That land had been in our family a long time. I glanced toward Emily again. Her expression had changed. Not fear. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. So I sold it. No one moved. It wasn't a hard decision. I shrugged gently. Land grows crops. But daughters grow futures. The silence that followed was different now. Not polite. Real. I didn't tell Emily, I continued. Because I didn't want her carrying that weight. A woman at one of the nearby tables lifted a hand to her mouth. I wanted her walking into those tall buildings thinking she belonged there. I folded the card slowly. So if tonight looks like the kind of place she was always meant for, well. I smiled softly. Then I guess that ladder worked. The room stayed still for a long moment. Across the floor, Emily's eyes had filled with tears she hadn't planned on. I wasn't angry when I looked at her. Not even a little. Just tired in the way men get after a long road. There's one more thing I wanted to say, I added gently. I rested the folded card in my pocket. This morning I signed papers for a little place up north. A few guests exchanged glances. Small cabin near a lake. I gestured vaguely. Nothing fancy. A soft ripple of curiosity passed through the room. I figured it was time for a quieter view. I looked toward Daniel then. Take good care of her. His posture straightened immediately. Yes, sir, he said quietly. Then I turned back to the room. And Emily. My voice softened. You never had to apologize for where you came from. The words hung there. Not sharp. Not accusing. Just true. I stepped away from the microphone. For a moment nobody clapped. People simply sat there absorbing what had been said. Then somewhere near the back a pair of hands came together. Slow. Measured. Another table followed. Then another. The applause grew gradually, not the loud roaring kind you hear at shows, but something steadier. Respectful. Emily crossed the dance floor before it finished. She reached me just as I stepped down from the small stage. Up close I could see the makeup artist's careful work beginning to smudge around her eyes. Dad, she whispered. For a moment she looked like that 6-year-old girl again. The one holding a jar full of lightning bugs. I didn't know, she said. I know, I answered. She wrapped her arms around me carefully so she wouldn't wrinkle the dress. The fabric rustled softly. I patted her shoulder the way fathers do when words would only make things messier. Behind us the band began playing again, soft piano at first, easing the room back toward celebration. People returned to their glasses. Their conversations. The rhythm of the evening. Weddings do that. They move forward whether emotions are neat or tangled. Later that night I slipped out before the dancing got loud. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon cleaner. Outside, the air had cooled. City lights stretched upward between the tall buildings Emily once dreamed about. I stood there for a while watching them. Not feeling smaller. Just, older. The funny thing about dignity is it doesn't make much noise. It doesn't ask the room to agree with it. It just stands where it is. Years have passed since that night. Emily visits the lake sometimes with her children. They run along the dock catching fireflies in mason jars while the sun settles behind the trees. When they hold those jars up, the lights inside look like tiny cities. And sometimes, when the porch is quiet and the world slows down, I think about that ballroom full of chandeliers and polished shoes. About the moment the microphone hummed. About how the calmest voice in the room can carry farther than anyone expects. Not because it's loud, but because it doesn't need to be.